It's finally here, the return of the NC Everything podcast. And I figured if I'm coming back, I might as well come back with a bang, or an almost bang. Because in this episode, I'm going to tell you about the time that not one, but 2 atomic bombs were dropped on North Carolina. But luckily without a bang. Welcome to episode 91 of the NC Everything podcast. I'm your host Curtis, and this is the bi-weekly show where I talk about everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. And that's right, I said bi-weekly show, but I'm going to address that in a minute. First of all, I want to thank all of you for being here. And if you're new to the NC Everything podcast, you may not need to listen to everything I'm about to say, but I'll sum up by saying I had some family issues and I had to stop the show for a while, but now I'm back with a few changes. As for you returning listeners, if any of you are still here, I have a few things to say. First and foremost, if you just want to get to the content and want to skip all this mess, just check the show notes or the show description, and right at the top, I'll have a timestamp of when the actual content starts. A lot of you already know this, but you go to that point, and it'll skip all this. All right, yes, I'm back, but like I said, with a few changes. Where the show used to come out every week, every Saturday, now it's going to be a bi-weekly show. It'll still come out it'll still come out on Saturdays, but it'll be every other Saturday. And I know this is disappointing for some of you, but by doing a bi-weekly show, hopefully when the stuff gets dodgy again, and I'm sure it will, this will give me some playroom so I won't have to shut the show down. I'll have time to get all my stuff done and do the editing and give you a consistent show. And speaking of shutting the show down, I can't even tell you guys how horrible I felt about that. I know this is a small show with a small listener base, but I've said a bunch of times on this show that if I only had one listener, I'd still do the show every time just for that one listener. This is something I created, and I'm really proud of it. And I really like, knowing that a few of you, listen to it every time it comes out. So to shut the show down, it kind of felt like I was abandoning you. And I know there's extenuating circumstances, and I got a lot of good feedback from you guys telling me, family first, and it's okay, and don't worry. But it still kind of hit hard. And then my farewell, I think it was like a 2-minute episode, a 2-minute video for the YouTube guys. I think back on that, and I wish I had more to say. It was still very, very fresh, and my mind was reeling. I wish I had something more substantial to say in that episode as opposed to goodbye. And to be honest with you, in that episode, in that 2-minute thing, I really didn't know if I was going to be able to do this ever again. So I was trying to, keep that hope out there. But when I got done, I told my wife I think I had said goodbye to the NC Everything podcast, and again, I had to swallow that on top of everything else going on. But it was a huge reminder that we take everything for granted. That's not a secret. But one day everything's fine. My job's great. My family life is great. I have a little podcast I'm proud of. And then bam, now I'm talking to lawyers and doctors and social workers and rest home managers. I'm balancing doctor's appointments and all kinds of other appointments with the county, with the state. And it just threw my life into a total tailspin. And I'd love to say that everything's good now. No, I'm more ready to expect the unexpected, but I still don't really know what tomorrow is going to be like. But I will say, on a good note, I was able to do all this stuff outside the podcast and maintain a 60-hour work week and somehow manage to find time for my wife and my kids. And I didn't go insane, so that kind of makes me feel pretty good. But anyway, that's enough of that. I want to go ahead and get into the content. But before I do, I just want to say, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss a show. And if you're watching on YouTube as opposed to listening on a podcast player, don't forget to subscribe there too, and you can watch every other week. You can also join the NC Everything Podcast Facebook group, by searching the NC Everything Podcast on Facebook, but I also have links for all that in the description or in the show notes. Sorry, I'm a little rusty. It's been a while since I promoted all that, but I'll get back in the swing of things soon, I hope. All right, well, let's get on with the show. In today's episode, we're heading down to Goldsboro. Goldsboro was almost ground zero when a B-52 bomber dropped 2 hydrogen bombs. Now, that wasn't intentional. It was kind of a freak accident, but I don't want to jump ahead. Let's go back to 1961. The Cold War has been going on for 14 years. Now, for those unfamiliar, the Cold War, in a nutshell, was a war between U.S. and Russia. Each country kept trying to outdo the other in weaponry, technology, and pretty much any other aspect they could think of. Now, it was essentially a pissing contest. No real battles were fought. That's why they call it a Cold War. However, most people will tell you that no battles were fought out in the open. There was a lot of espionage and, people died. There were real fights. And a lot of people will tell you that the Cold War never really ended. Now, I'm not going to go in a conspiracy rabbit hole, but I kind of agree with that too. But anyway, during the Cold War, there was always this fear of nuclear attack. My dad, he used to tell me how when he was going to school, they would do detonation drills. I'm not sure if that's what it was called, but in case of a nuclear attack, they would get underneath their desk and cover their head. So now let's talk about Operation Chrome Dome. The goal of Operation Chrome Dome was to keep B-52 bombers armed with nuclear weapons in the air over the northern hemisphere 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. This was mainly an effort to be ready for action should Russia decide to do more than just run their mouth. Now, Operation Chrome Dome ran from 1960 to 1968. And if you're watching from YouTube, you're going to see me looking down at this laptop a lot more than I used to. I do have a script here. I'm not necessarily sticking to it, but I'm relying heavily on it. Again, that's going to speed up the editing process, I hope. Anyway, Operation Chrome Dome ran from 1960 to 1968. Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, which is down in Goldsboro, was part of Operation Chrome Dome. Now let's focus on the night of January 24th, 1961. A B-52 bomber carrying 2 3.8 megaton hydrogen bombs was flying over Goldsboro. Now, I'm sorry to over-explain, it's kind of my thing, but I want to break this down just a little bit. The B-52 bomber is described as a long-range, subsonic, jet-powered strategic bomber. Subsonic means that the max speed of the jet is less than Mach 1, or the speed of sound. So this particular jet didn't go the speed of sound. It actually maxed out at 650 miles per hour, and it had a wingspan of 185 feet, or 61.5 yards. Now let's talk about the bombs. Again, they were 2 3.8 megaton hydrogen bombs. A megaton measures explosive power. 1 megaton is equal to 1 million tons of TNT. Since the bomber was carrying 2 3.8 megaton bombs, the explosive power on board was equal to 7,600,000 tons of TNT. Now, to put that in perspective, the bomb dropped on Nagasaki, Japan was 20,000 tons of metaphorical TNT, and Hiroshima was 15,000 tons of metaphorical TNT. So those two bombs together were 35,000 tons of TNT, or the explosive power. This payload was 7,600,000 metaphorical tons of TNT. And I'm not going to keep saying metaphorical tons of TNT. I think you get the point. One other thing I want to clarify is that the bombs dropped in Japan were atomic bombs. The bombs on this plane were hydrogen bombs, and they had never been used in warfare. The difference, for those who are curious, is that the atomic bomb uses fission, F-I-S-S-I-O-N, and that's where an atom separates into two pieces. The hydrogen bomb uses fusion, F-U-S-I-O-N, which takes two separate atoms and puts them together to make a third atom. Now that's way outside my knowledge, as some of you can see by the way I was staring at the laptop while I was reading that. But the hydrogen bomb using fusion is far larger, or creates a far larger explosion than the atomic bomb. Okay, so now you have an idea of what was in the air that January night in 1961 over North Carolina. Now let's get to the incident, or accident. Anyway, at the time of the disaster, the B-52 had been flying for about 12 hours. Everything seems fine, but suddenly the plane springs a fuel leak. Now this next part gets a little confusing. The captain of the B-52, Captain Walter Tulloch, gets Seymour Johnson Air Force Base on the horn, and he requests an emergency landing. But then when Seymour Johnson gives orders for them to return to base, Captain Tulloch ignores the order. I'm not sure, that may not be the full story. But it said his plan was to burn off more of the plane's fuel before landing. This was an effort to minimize the explosion should the B-52 crash land. Unfortunately, the fuel leak got worse before he could burn up any more fuel, and he was forced to turn around and return to base. However, the plane never made it back to base. Now, I haven't really mentioned the crew on the plane, but there were 8 men on board: the pilot, the co-pilot, and 6 crewmen. The pilot, the co-pilot, and 6 crewmen. For some reason, and I couldn't find out why, on the way back to Seymour Johnson, the pilots lost control of the plane and everybody was ordered to abandon ship. Here's the thing. Of the 8 men on board, only 6 of them sat in ejection seats. At the end of this, 5 of the men abandoned the craft and survived. 1 ejected but died in the crash, and 2 men died in the plane itself. The plane went down in a field in Goldsboro, near Musgraves Crossroads. And the plane went down 12 seconds after everybody who could get out got out. They say the B-52 hit the ground at almost the speed of sound. And when it hit, it obliterated the plane, and it scattered pieces of debris all around the impact site for hundreds of feet. One witness said that the plane spun through the sky like a Roman candle. A farmer who lived nearby said he could hear the whine of an airplane about to land, and then there was this big explosion. Speaking of airplanes, the farmer that I mentioned said when he got up to look, it looked like the whole entire field was on fire. Now, immediately, people from all around jumped up and sprang into action. And of course, that includes the media. They got wind that there was a crashed military plane in rural North Carolina. They certainly came a-running. So controlling what was said about the payload on board was going to be kind of difficult. But the military did their best to make sure people didn't know that 2 atomic bombs had just crashed in North Carolina. But what did happen to the bombs? One of the bombs crashed with the plane. The other parachuted down just fine. Well, not really just fine. The bomb somehow completed 6 of the 7 steps required to detonate. And so when it was recovered, they found it armed and ready. So, just to clarify, 6 of the 7 steps. That means 1 more step and this bastard would have detonated in North Carolina. And remember, Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but a whole lot worse. Now the second bomb, it crashed with the plane. But when it crashed, it sent the hydrogen core 180 feet into the ground. And in true government fashion, these facts about the bombs, well, that had to be covered up and hidden. And so the military, they got up with the media and they gave their version of the story. The media relayed that the Air Force said that everything was safe, there was no danger in the area, and the bombs were not armed. Which, in their defense, in that moment, during the Cold War, I really wouldn't want to know that an armed atomic weapon had just crashed down outside my house. Well, I guess it can go either way. It's one of those things. Do you really want to know the truth? After the crash, the site was cleaned up, and they dug down and dug and dug and dug to try to recover that hydrogen core that had went 180 feet in the ground, but it was never recovered. Ultimately, the hole that they dug to try to get that hydrogen core was filled back up, and a 400-foot diameter perimeter fence was put up around the area. The government purchased all the land inside that perimeter fence, and they called that a job done. And today the government still owns that little plot of land inside this little area. And like I said, today the hydrogen core is still down there 180 feet in the ground. And the field around the crash site is still being used, but they warn farmers not to dig down more than 5 feet into the ground. Now, I don't know exactly what they're growing on that field, but 5 feet down or not, I hope I'm not eating whatever they're growing out of that field. Now let's talk about that hydrogen core just a minute. A hydrogen core has a half-life of 24,000 years. What that means is it will take 24,000 years for the power of that core to become half as strong or to lose half its power. And 24,000 years for us, that's a huge number. That's not something we're worried about, 24,000 years. We're not worried about being around in that time, but you might as well say forever. If it's going to take 24,000 years for that hydrogen core to reach half its power, I guess, 48,000 years for it to, eventually lose all power. That's forever. You can use those huge numbers, but that's forever. Now, before I wrap this thing up, I want to go back to the crew for just a minute. Remember I said that 2 died in the crash? 1 man ejected but perished nevertheless, and 5 men survived. One of those survivors was a man named Adam Maddox. Not only was he the youngest crew member on board that night, but he was also the only African American. And since he lived to tell the story, I felt like it was only right to share that story with you. Adam Maddox was not sitting in an ejection seat on the night of the crash. In order for him to attempt to save himself, he had to wait for the rest of the crew to eject so that he could strap on a parachute and jump through a window in the plane. And remember, they said the plane was spinning like a Roman candle. But here's another important detail about Adam Maddox. He's a very religious man. He went on to say that while he was still inside the plane during the crash, he had decided that if it was his time to go, so be it. But then something miraculous happened. The plane stalled. And I'm assuming that means the spin kind of hung on a minute. Well, he jumped at the opportunity. He throws on a parachute and jumps out the window. So he's in midair, he pulls his parachute, but nothing happens. Now, they think that most likely he was going too slow for the parachute to actually open, but he was picking up speed. Finally, poof, the parachute opens up. Maddox, he thanks God for saving his life, but then something happened. The plane that was now on the ground exploded, and this deflated his parachute. So now he began free falling again, but then something happened. An updraft reinflated the parachute, and so now he's, gliding slowly, down to the ground, and again he thanked God for saving his life. But then something happened. He realized that he was drifting right down into the heart of the crash, and most likely he was going to burn to death when he got to the ground. But then something happened. A gust of wind, or maybe a thermal updraft from the flames, pushed him away from the crash site. Ultimately, he landed safely in the field. But, yes, something happened. His night isn't over yet. He walks to a nearby farmhouse and he gets a ride to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. He gets to the guardhouse at Seymour Johnson and he tells the guards everything that just happened. And they don't believe him, and they arrest him for stealing the parachute. Now, eventually, he did convince somebody that he didn't steal the parachute and he wasn't making the story up, and he wasn't a thief. And I guess everything kind of worked out okay from there. I hope the man had a really good life from there. But ultimately, Adam Maddox would die in 2018 as the only aviator to ever bail out of a B-52 with no ejector seat and survive. And that's episode 91, guys. I know it was kind of a short one. Hopefully I'll get you some longer episodes as we go. I'm thinking about doing some North Carolina mysteries in my next episode. It'll be one of those episodes where it's, 4 or 5 different stories in one episode. But that's how we had 2 nuclear bombs dropped on our beautiful state of North Carolina. Thank you guys for sticking around and listening. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you're listening or watching the show. And don't forget you can use the links below to join the Facebook group. Check out the website, which there is a link, but it's www.thenceverythingpodcast.com. And if you're curious about my sources, I have a link down below that'll take you to a list of the sources I used to put together this episode. As far as the website goes, I'm not really that happy with it. I've never really been all that happy with it. I'm not much of a web designer. It is a place where you can go and get all the episodes, and it's the headquarters for the NC Everything podcast. But it's a Squarespace site. I'm happy with Squarespace. I'm not happy with the design. I don't really know what I'm doing. So don't judge me on the website. Maybe one day I'll get a really flashy, cool website going. But if you listen to my whole spiel at the beginning of this episode, obviously I don't have time, or you can see I obviously don't have time to do a whole lot of web design or research on how to design a nice, pretty website. Anyway, now I'm getting into that rambling mess. So I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I'll talk to you in a couple weeks.